This conference will now be recorded.
Probably have 304. Do you wanna start or
Okay, I think I'll get started.
okay?
So hi folks, welcome. Dan, Megan, Nick. I'm just going down the list. Ellie, Jackie, and I said Megan already, and Bill. So actually Nick. So what? Never mind. So it's good that Nick is here, for example, because a lot of this is of course relevant to the USDA, and in fact I will be talking a little bit about the Farm Bill. As well as a couple of other two pieces of legislation, the Farm Bill and the Ag Resilience Bill, which is not law yet, and a couple of other things. Without further ado, let me get started. So hang on, sorry, here we go. Okay, so why this talk, right? This is there are going to be two ESIP winter meeting sessions, as some of you know, coming up. That this is a preview for those two sessions. The first session is essentially what you see on the screen here. The first session, my cursor is hovering over. It's almost like a introductory tutorial to science technology policy, right? And so this is an introductory tutorial to what like a science and technology policy fellow might go through when the science and technology policy fellow join the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. So this is a compressed 90-minute version of that knowledge. Second session that we have, which is approved for the winter session, is titled Carbon Management, Food, Ag, Human Wellbeing, Using Informatics to Connect the Climate Action Dots. We will be inviting at least 3 speakers. One speaker from the RDG, the Research Data Alliance, who's going to talk about sustainable development goals. And so our hope is actually to connect the dots between the sustainable development goals and maybe even some US-oriented policies. And so we'll be covering largely the US-oriented policies here in this talk, at least very briefly on a very cursory manner because we don't have much time. And this talk is also in line with the upcoming winter meeting sessions to promote, transdisciplinary thinking and systems thinking. But I use these terms to apply to more than just thinking about, instead of thinking about ecology, instead of thinking about geology, instead of thinking about forestry, but we're actually looking at social environmental systems, or you can call it social ecological systems if you wanted to cut the number of terms to this. So by systems thinking, transdisciplinary thinking, I'm also addressing the need for people to be aware of your role in the science technology policy arena. I mean, most of us would fit into either the science or the technology kind of pegs, right? And there'll be some of us who fit in the policy pegs, but kind of be aware of whom the other people around the room are and the roles that they play in the going from an idea to data to science and to decisions and to actions, right? Where does each of us fit into this pipeline, and what are our respective contributions? And the documents that we'll be looking at in this talk are, right, President-elect Biden's Plan for Climate Change and Environmental Justice. We're taking a preview, perhaps, of what his team, what the administration will think about, at least as judged from what President-elect Biden has stated on his website for the Plan for Climate Change and Environmental Justice. We'll also be taking a look at this thing called Climate 21 So the Climate 21 project is actually a group of ex-Obama administration officials who got together, and over the course of a year and a half, they put together various memos to be forwarded to the incoming transition team. The transition team right now, of course, is already active. These memos are almost like a plan or like a guideposts or guide stars as to what the transition team should be thinking about as they staff up the Biden administration. So that's one of the documents that one of many documents that we'll be looking inside the set of documents delivered by the Climate 21 project. We'll also be looking at the U.S. Farm Bill 2018, and this is the all-important farm bill that you hear every 5-6 years, right? And it contains, it outlines and authorizes programs that are extremely important, including things like food stamps that's contained inside the farm bill. But we will be looking more at things like the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, inside the farm bill, and how that contributes to carbon management. And also we will show, I'll go through a quick Neo4j demo. So this demo is what I will actually show you right now, just for 1 or 2 minutes, and we will do a more thorough demo towards the end of the talk, maybe half an hour from now. But this Neo4j demo, we will look at the Ag Resilience Act, which is just legislation right now, proposed legislation, but not law, because it has not been passed through the committees. It is currently, I believe, a Senate bill, or is it? No, it's a House bill, right? So it's been proposed in the House, not taken up in the Senate, and so it remains very far from becoming actual law. But I will add one thing here that I forgot to add into this page, is that the Neo4j demo will also show us the U.S. Farm Bill. I've managed to incorporate the Farm Bill into this demo, which we'll see in about 2 seconds. And we will also look at the Sustainable Development Goals. So with this, everybody knows everything's connected to everything, and let's go into the demo very quickly, just for like 2 minutes at the most. So get prepared. When I switch over to the demo, we will bring up what's called a graph database. Again, I'll go through this in more details, but this graph database will give you a visualization like what you're seeing on the screen, where it shows you how the Biden climate plan is related to the Climate 21 memo, and in this case, it's related to the SDG targets. But we will look at some of the US legislation later, but for now, we'll just do Biden plan, climate memo, and SDG targets. How are these things related? So let me escape out and bring up this screen. Okay, so what you see here on the screen is actually a query interface. It's blank right now, but as you can see here on the right-hand side, we have these entities: the Biden climate plan, the Climate 21 memo, and so these are color codes. This is the legend for what you will see. And so let's begin. I said we will start with the Biden climate plan. So I will explain a little bit more of what I'm doing here, just to give you the rough flow of things. This query screen is actually going to talk to what's called a graph database running on my computer. And what I'm doing now is the query is suggesting to me that I can pull up information on the climate plan and how the climate plan is mapped to ontologies, ontology terms. I wouldn't go into that too much, but how the climate plan is linked to ontology terms in the ENVO ontology, for those who are familiar with ontologies, right? And then furthermore, how these terms that are related to the climate plan in the ontology can be linked to concepts in the Climate 21 memo. And again, we can dive back down from the memo. Let's go back down again to a bunch of ontology terms which are shared between the memo and selected SDG targets. And let's stop here and hit return. So what you see here is, let me give you another view of this. What you see here is, whoops. Give me a second. My computer gets slow when I share my screen because of lack of memory. Yep, let's try that again. Hang on, let me zoom out. I think the database is just spinning. I'm going to try this view. Huh, interesting. Come on, run the query. Okay, dangers of a live demo. This didn't. It did retrieve the data I was looking for, but it is not for some reason showing us. I tell you what, I will shut this down and later during a Q&A, let me respin this up. But back to the show, and I'll give you the live demo towards the end of the talk. Anyway, what you were supposed to see was a live demo of how the database can pull up the connections and the relationships between these various documents. We will try to do that again towards the end of the talk. But for now, let's move on to dive a little bit into the Biden climate plan. So what I'm showing you here on the screen is this is an image of a big scale picture of the Biden climate plan and what it entails. And the Biden climate plan, if you were to do a bit of detective work, it is based on a DOE, a Department of Energy, task force report. This graphic that you see here is from that report. All right, so strangely enough, we're going to talk about, of course, carbon sequestration in forests and also in agriculture, but the DOE task force report does address these things because if you look at the diagram here, the DOE report talks about air capture of CO2 via biological means. And in particular, they talk about inorganic carbon and how inorganic carbon can be captured, of course, eventually in grasslands and agriculture as well as in forests. So that's just to give you a preview of what's coming. Now let's move on to the next slide. So this is, don't worry about this. It's a concept map, but I will go through parts of the concept map as we go on through the talk. But we will go through the parts of this concept map bit by bit, but this is in effect what we're going to work through for the next maybe 5 minutes. Now, zooming in on that concept map. So Biden's clean energy revolution and environmental justice plan, all right? It has, if you look at it, there are 3 parts that are selected from the plan. He talks about leverage agriculture to remove CO2 and sequester CO2 in the ground, decarbonizing food and ag sector, and also promoting the use of biofuels. Again, if you do a bit of detective work, you'll find that these 3 concepts are actually referred to, came from a Department of Energy task force report on the R&D strategy for CO2 utilization and negative emissions at the gigaton scale. So they're talking about processes that we should be looking at, to reduce carbon emissions at the gigaton scale, right? But if you look into the report, okay, and which is where we'll cover it later, we'll cover this part of the talk later. This report is authored by the DOE, and you'll see an interesting relationship here, of course, because going back up to President-elect Biden's plan, you will see that he proposes to establish something called an ARPA-C. The ARPA-C is actually modeled after the ARPA-E, which is modeled after DARPA. ARPA-E is the Department of Energy equivalent of DARPA, right? So they're going to go, the proposal is to establish an ARPA-C. Now, if you look at USDA under the 2018 Farm Bill, the Farm Bill has authorized the creation of something called USDA Agriculture Advanced Research and Development Authority, AGARDA. This in itself, of course, is modeled after DARPA. So there's the incoming, this is authorized by current law. ARPA-C, of course, has not been, it's up to the incoming administration to either convince Congress that, Congress needs to authorize the creation of an ARPA-C, which probably will be a challenge, given the challenges that ARPA-E faced in Congress when the conversation around ARPA-E was first mentioned a few years ago. Right. Anyway, so just to give you a flavor that what you're about to hear from the task force from DOE has clearly influenced, President-elect Biden's team's thinking about what they should do. Right. So the next slide is diving into the recommendations of the task force, and in particular, these are the parts of the task force recommendations that talk about harnessing the natural biological cycle for carbon management. And there are parts to this. Now, what you see on the screen here and what you see, in fact, in this whole presentation is not exhaustive. I've selected bits and pieces which are interesting to our community and focused on that. But if you look at when the task force talks about harnessing natural biological carbon cycles, what they're referring to is, for example, optimizing the allocation of crops, food, and bioenergy, feed, and fiber. And so by this, I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on this little box here, because when we talk about crops for food, that's obvious, but crops for bioenergy, so that could be anything from cheatgrass and using cheatgrass for biofuels to growing forests for wood pellets that can be sold for stoves. In fact, that's one way of quote unquote, some people call it clean energy, but that's subject to interpretation. But forestry for wood pellets to burn stoves and all that is one way that maybe is carbon neutral, depending on how you calculate it. But also crops for feed, for animal, for our animal agriculture, right? And fiber, obviously, just for wood products. But these are this is an interesting and problematic area. How do you optimize the allocation? And we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we go back to USDA, right? But here obviously this objective of optimizing the allocation of food for crops, energy, feed, and fiber, you run up against some of this challenge of how do you also make sure that you're not hurting biodiversity across the landscape, and how do you maintain the health of the landscape as a whole? Again, these are things that we will return to later in the talk. But other parts of the plan from the Department of Energy identifies things like we need to identify approaches to reduce soil organic carbon decomposition, so that the carbon stays in the soil, and we find ways to actually promote the length of the tenants, the length of the time that soil carbon stays captured in the ground. Okay, and they also talk about optimizing crops and management technology to stabilize soil organic carbon. And one of the things that is talked about in the plan, which is you find it very predominantly discussed also in a USDA circles, of course, is tillage practices that are less destructive for carbon by adopting no-till or low-till or ridge tilling, or a number of other methods that USDA promotes that are equivalent to a no-till or low-till agriculture method. So these are the things talked about in the DOE report. I'm going to go to the next slide. And so these are the issues that we just highlighted very quickly, right? But what we're talking about here in the DOE report, thinking about social environmental systems, is ecosystem services, like what I'm seeing here on the screen, and how do you trade off these ecosystem services, right? We talked about under farm management. These are the practices on the farm, things like tillage, which I just talked about, crop diversity, crop rotations, cover cropping. These are different ways to promote health of the soil. For example, legumes as cover crops, or help to regenerate the soil in terms of nitrogen in the soil. Now, but how do you schedule the use of legumes in conjunction with your cash crops, and how do you schedule that and rotate that in a way that maximizes soil health? But that kind of practice is very much dependent on the kinds of equipment that you have for tillage. I mean, so tillage is when come springtime, you need to prepare your fields for planting. Now, so what that's the scale, the field size that we're talking about, the scale of your farms are so large that equipment matters, right? The farming equipment that you use matters, and the farming equipment, of course, is very much tied to the kind of tillage that you can use for for the crops, the cash crops, for example, that you want to plant. So there are many. This is in and of itself, farm management is a complex. There are complex trade-offs in and of itself in this box. But when you take a step back and you look at the larger picture, of course, you're trading off provisioning system services that are of benefit to humans, and you're trading off these ecosystem services versus ecosystem services that may not be as directly evident to be beneficial for humans. Things like biodiversity, wildlife habitat. How do you manage your nutrient runoff? Reduce your sedimentation of your waterways by reducing erosion, say through cover crops, right, and so on and so forth. So these things that they mentioned in the DOE plan are pretty much pretty much a conceptual issue of how do you trade off these various ecosystem, or if you want to say agro-ecosystem services. And again, these considerations are carried over even to the USDA arena naturally. And so in the later part of the talk, I will not talk so much about this, but this should be at the back of your minds, right? So I'm going to go to the next slide. This is the last part of the DOE report. I'm not going to spend too much time on this since we have other things to talk about. But besides looking at biological systems for sequestering carbon, the DOE report also talks about how do you promote systems modeling capacity within DOE. And of interest to the ESIP community, of course, is they stress the need to pay attention to the way that we're collecting and analyzing data so that the data can be used for model validation. But in terms of modeling challenges going on here onwards, one of the challenges that was stressed in the DOE report is the nonlinear behavior of your Earth systems as your carbon pools change. That is hard to model because we're talking about places where you have your system goes into a totally different state, and those states are not well understood. How do you make the transition between one state and another? So these kinds of non-linear behaviors are still not very well captured, and that's what's called for. The DOE reports call for more funding in this regard. All right, and the last one, which is kind of a fun topic, which is about the parametric sensitivity of models, and that of course creates issues with the scientists going to the policymakers to say, well, we have this model that is suggesting that you might want to look at these other policy measures because there's a probability that the model outcome is saying this way, but there's an uncertainty due to that, of course. And so this is a topic that is recommended for further exploration in the DOE report. Right, so let's go to the next part, which is the climate memo. So remember, this is the one produced over a year and a half, and it's produced by a group of ex-Obama administration officials, as well as other folks from think tanks and universities. And they produce quite a number of memos, everything that is destined for reading by the DOT, the Department of Transportation Transition Team, Department of State Transition Team, Department of the Energy Transition Team, Department of Interior Transition Team. But we're going to focus on the Department of Agriculture Transition Team. This is the memo that they have produced, and we're going to go through that and highlight the parts that talk about carbon and that talk about data in particular. So next slide. Again, this is just kind of a, don't bother to, well, maybe you should bother to read. Hang on, just give me a second. Yeah, don't bother to read this slide. This is just a quick visual of what we're going to go through very quickly. All right, so on the next slide, we're going to zoom in to your right-hand side of this concept map. So the right-hand side of the concept map essentially is just who and why produced this memo for the USDA out of the Climate 21 project. I mentioned again already, the authors, comprises members of the, actually, the authors, some of the authors came from the Obama administration, and some of the authors, at least two of them, are on the current transition team for USDA. So you know that they have a good idea of what they are recommending to the transition team, and now they are part of the transition team. The objectives of this particular memo on USDA include, right, spelling out a framework to maximize USDA's contribution to US government-wide mitigation and adaptation effort. Now, US-wide mitigation and adaptation effort, again, going back to the Biden climate plan, you remember there was a stipulation for things like ARPA-C, which will be, is DOE, but of course it's going to be interagency. But there have been additional proposals, like we have at the US government level, we have the Council for Environmental Quality, we have the Council for Council of Economic Advisors. I don't exactly remember what the term is, but there's also been a proposal, cannot remember from who, that we should have a Council for Climate at that same level, right? So anyway, there is an expectation of US-wide mitigation and adaptation effort, and so this memo is to ready the USDA to take part in that US government-wide mitigation and adaptation effort with regards to climate. But interestingly enough, and this is something that we'll cover in the winter meeting session, this memo recommends a couple of actions that do not require new legislation. It doesn't require Congress to act. So these are either authorities within the Ag Secretary's authority, meaning the Ag Secretary can issue what are called secretarial orders. And so secretarial orders are things like even the Department of Interior. If you look at the Department of Interior, the Interior Secretary also has in the past and these issued secretarial orders that all bureaus within the agency needs to conform to. And other options that do not require legislation, that do not require Congress's action, of course, are things like executive orders, right? So we will cover these more, maybe a little bit more in the January session. But going to the other side of the diagram of what this memo covers, we will focus, I think, let's go down from left to right. All right, so the memo also talks about incentives for smart agriculture through crop insurance policies, but there's almost like a prerequisite. When you look at this recommendation for creating incentives for new crop insurance policies, the one caveat that they put here is that, they mentioned that we do need to improve the state of data collection and analysis of data on how we're managing carbon in order to inform how we create these new insurance policies. And some of this data also will be used to create a proposed carbon bank, which I will not go into, but I did not reflect this in this presentation. But there's an explicit reference to some of the provisions in the 2018 Farm Bill related to data management, which we will examine very closely. So if we, the kind of almost implication is that the USDA should be looking into some of the provisions that are captured in the 2018 Farm Bill related to data management, so that the USDA can create new incentives for smart ag, so that the USDA can rebuild and focus science resources, all right? And also, one of the interesting things, again, I'm moving away from data management, but one of the interesting things called for in the memo, which relates to people whom we've interacted in the past, as far as the Ag and Climate Cluster goes, is the USDA Climate Hub. We've had interesting interactions with and invited speakers from USDA Climate Hub in the past, and so this affects our friends out there. But interestingly enough, and this shouldn't be a surprise, because in line with what we have been discussing over the past 6, 7, 8 months, wildfire management and forest restoration is mentioned quite a bit in this new memo, and it talks about, you know, we need to develop methods, and we need to develop targets. So these are management targets that encourage forest restoration that lower the fire threat, right? And so when it comes to carbon, again, there's a call for maintaining long-term carbon sequestration on Forest Service lands, right? So this is what these are the emphases that I've chosen to pull out from the memo, right? Let's talk a little bit more about the Farm Bill, though, because the Farm Bill is highly important when we talk about carbon, and when we talk about our friends at USDA. Now, so the 2018 Farm Bill, there's quite a lot to go through. This is a quick snapshot, but like I mentioned before, earlier in the talk, the Farm Bill authorizes programs like SNAP. This is the food stamp program, right? So we also authorizes things like the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Conservation Reserve Program, the CRP and the CSP. The difference between, now the CSP is applicable for agricultural lands currently in production. And so if you are a farmer and you are working your fields, there are funds that you can apply to help you maintain your fields in service of selected ecosystem services. Again, going back to that discussion that we had earlier about agro-ecosystem services. So this program is for existing lands under cultivation currently. The CRP, which also is an important program, it is a means for farmers to take their lands out of temporary production to let the lands recover, build soil health, and again, things like build carbon in the ground, improve soil porosity, you know, so that you have better, so that it has a bigger impact on biodiversity across the landscape, right? So these are the examples of programs authorized and sometimes funded under the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill is extremely important. The bill is reauthorized every 5 to 6 years. The current bill we are living under the HR2, which was signed into, which is the kind of the legislative ID for the law. So the Farm Bill, when somebody says the Farm Bill and the Agriculture Improvement Act of 2018, we're talking about the same thing. Or if they say we're talking about HR2 from 115 Congress, we're all talking about the same thing. Now, so this bill signed into law at the end of 2018 and expires in 2023. And the danger of some of it gets complicated, but some of these programs that are funded under the Farm Bill will kind of run to a halt. Some of the programs will continue even if the Farm Bill is expired, but that's due to the way that some of the funds for these things are appropriated and funded. That gets into a whole mess, which we're not going to. And the Farm Bill is it involves a lot of money. It's $428 billion over 5 years, right? So extremely important piece of legislation. Now, I'm only going to focus here on some of the informatics stuff related to the Farm Bill, and I'm going to turn it over for questions and discussion. So the provisions in the Farm Bill talk about things like data for the use of on the use and effect of conservation practices. This is actually very important. I don't know that much about it, but essentially what the farm what this is trying to talk about is they're trying to capture how management practices are exercised on the landscape, and how those management practices, again, we things like low tillage practices or their use of cover crops, or how do they cycle their cover crops through the multiple years of growing. Now, so there is talk about how we want to capture these information in a way that captures also how the soil is responding, how the farmers may be profiting from these new management practices or not, crop yield and things like that. But also for us, some of us who have been involved in drought stuff, the Farm Bill also talks about data for the U.S. Drought Monitor. The U.S. Drought Monitor actually is a program. Oops, here we go. I've it documented here. It's a joint program between the USDA, NOAA, and the University of Nebraska, right? But it talks about the Farm Bill talks about under the Drought Monitor, it encourages the development of standardized the developments of standards to integrate in situ soil moisture profiles, which is interesting. But it also talks about the possible use of citizen science data and references something called the Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act. Now, this one we're going to talk this Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act we're going to talk about in the January session, the Introduction to Science Technology Policy, Science Technology Policy, because we meaning ESIP, there's actually a faint fingerprint of language contributed by ESIP that survives in this piece of U.S. law. So this is not just a bill that is discussed and punted around in Congress. This bill has actually become U.S. law. So there's a faint ESIP fingerprint, and I can show exactly where in the U.S. law we contributed to. But this is, and we're going to talk about this in January. And we don't have time for this. This actually is personally very interesting to me. But the Farm Bill parts that relates to data talks also about integration of data, integration of genomic, phenotypic, nutrition, environmental data, so as to promote our capabilities in terms of understanding how genomes and phenomes, how genomes are expressed as phenomes, of course, in plants and animals, but how is that influencing the environment and being influenced by the environment, so that again we can manage these. We can manage our agriculture in a way that benefits the environment, that benefits nutrition, and that kind of thing, right? So that there's a genome to phenome initiative that is talked about in the Farm Bill. Very interesting stuff, which also encourages open software and open data. But so the bad things, the good things about the Farm Bill refers to this piece of law called the Data Act of 2018. This is a separate law. It originated, I believe, in the Senate, and then it got subsumed into the Farm Bill. So this is a very common thing that happens in Congress when they write bills. You write a bill that kind of is like happily living on its own, and then at some point in time it gets sucked into a bigger piece of law, right? So this happened to the Citizen Science and Crowdsourcing Act. It started as a happy bill in Senator Coons of Delaware's office, and then it eventually got sucked into a bigger bill that affected NSF, NASA, and NOAA, right? But so we have this bill to thank for the Data Act of 2018. There are some good things about it. It stresses interoperability. If you look at this Data Act, it even talks about compatible format, although it doesn't define it, of course, because there's no place in US law at that level to define what do you mean by compatible format. I mean, in some ways it's good that they left it kind of fuzzy. Anyway, the law leaves it fuzzy, which in this case is good. What do you mean by compatible format? And it doesn't exactly say what's interoperability, but which is great too. The not so good things about the Data Act is you see that that there's no mention of machine readability, which to our community is important. Although I note here that machine readability is actually defined in another piece of law called the Open Government Data Act, which was passed not too long ago. And this Data Act talks about conservation and farm productivity data warehouse. The term data warehouse is bad because the idea of warehouse is archaic, and I don't think it's that applicable. But again, it kind of depends on what the author mean, what the Congress mean when they say warehouse. But the kind of the notional definition of warehouse is not necessarily, I think, a good idea to put inside law. Anyway, these are things that I've observed as I looked at the Data Act. Now, so I'm going to stop here and ask for questions. And if we have time, we will go back to the Neo4j. I'm going to refire up the Neo4j while I pause here for questions. The question to you, so if you have any questions, let's ask them now. But also, it would be beneficial if you ask yourself, like, based on what you saw in the previous slides, where did you see for yourself a role for your expertise and your research? So while you ponder that, let me, this is stuck. Let me try to fire up. Oh boy. This is firing up in the background. It will take time because my machine is struggling, but questions? Whoops. Questions?
Could I ask when you were going in and parsing the trees that you built were parsed off of 3 different PDFs, 3 different reports.
Mm-hmm.
How did you prepare your thoughts and the rule set for parsing as you were going through it? Is that a fair question?
Yes, actually, that's a very good question. I will show. So actually, I will show that answer a little bit here. There are 2 slides down. I will talk a little bit about that. So let me hold your question. I'll come back to it. But Dan, I think you had a question in the chat box I saw earlier. I'm struggling to bring up. Oops, never mind.
It's unrelated. Don't worry.
Oh, okay.
It's related to the very first overview. We'll be talking about that later.
Okay. So Dan had a question which I will answer 2 slides down. Does anybody else have a question on any stuff that you previously saw? Let me just escape the screen just to give you a visual reminder of what we went through.
Brian, just a general question about Climate 21, that group. So you mentioned that they began this like a year and a half ago. Some folks from the Obama administration and some others. When they did this, how much interaction did they have with the Biden campaign at the time?
I don't know, but I suspect nothing much happens by accident. So
it wasn't just a bunch of people saying, well, on the just in case Biden wins, we want to get ready to.
Yeah.
It's not that, right? They must have some kind of discussion between the 2 groups, I suppose.
I suppose too. Because it's not nefarious in any way, of course, because there is a lot to be done, and if they waited until there was a confirmation that Biden will be elected, that there will be a lot of mad scrambling to do. I mean, as it is already, there's a lot of mad scrambling to be done now, and mad scrambling to be done next year. It's just going to be another crazy 4 years of mad scrambling to to do a lot of stuff, to redo a lot of stuff.
Yeah, but it should be this material providing this plan shouldn't come as a surprise to the new incoming administration.
Yeah, I shouldn't. In fact, I say if you look at the lead authors for this USDA memo, at least 2 of the lead authors are on the current USDA transition team. And my guess, of course, is that the lead authors who have gone on to the transition team, members of the transition team will probably find some useful role for themselves in the new administration as, like political appointees. I think they call them Schedule C employees is the official term.
I don't think we're supposed to be talking about this on a recorded line.
Oh, it's okay. I'm not the, I used to be, I used to watch my language when I was working in government relations, but now that I'm not working in government relations, I'm going like, yo, this is my freedom. But if I ever get back into government relations, yeah, I will not talk about this on a recorded line. So if there are no further questions, let me quickly go through a quick demo and a quick explanation of Neo4j. So stop me at any time if you do have a question, and I'm going to get to Dan's question. I'm going to present this. But what I did in order to get those relationships, I used something called a graph database, a Neo4j. These labor property graph databases are different in nature from relational databases that most of us are familiar with. Although there have been cases where there are products which are sold as a graph database, but in actual fact, if you dig under the hood, it's actually a relational database that's running kind of a graph-like structure. But anyway, this is a depiction of what a graph database is good at. Here I picked an example of a real graph database that is used to explore the relationships of the fauna and flora in Yellowstone National Park, right? And so this graph database was used very interestingly enough to show the trophic structures in Yellowstone National Park and how how the predation of wolves on deer ultimately affect things like the structure of beaver ponds. So these are the intermediate effects, right? And so it's graph databases are great for looking at these kinds of things, and so it's also great for looking at the relationships between what one document says about this concept like carbon sequestration or deforestation and other concepts talked about in other documents. And if you know structured query language SQL used to query like relational databases, Neo4j has a query language called Cypher that you use to query a database. It's kind of like SQL, but it has its across unique flavors. Now this is the part where I get to Dan's question. The methodology I did was I'm now running Neo4j on my laptop, which is why that demo kind of crashed because my laptop is struggling, right? With a Neo4j database running, and actually I think I've really shut down my Python integrated development environment. But this Neo4j is running on a laptop, although it also runs in the cloud. And we meaning Bill, myself, 2 USGS employees, have a funded ESIP lab project where we have a Neo4j database in the cloud. But this particular one is actually just on my desktop. There is a Python program that I use to parse a given text file, and this is getting to Dan's question. So Dan, actually, if you look at what I did for the DOE task force report, I could have thrown the entire task force report add this Python program. This Python program, what it does is that it uses a couple of established Python libraries like NLTK. There's one called NLTK, and there's another one called OWL2. Oh gosh, I can't remember the exact name. But this OWL library is used for parsing ontologies, right? So I use these established libraries. NLTK will go through your text file, and it would destructure your text file into sentences, and then from sentences it destructures it into words, and that's where these words are run against an ontology. Like in this case, I used the Envo ontology, and this is code that I borrowed from Tom Nayrock, so whom some of you know. He wrote some code that does this going through of a text document and comparing the text in the text document to see if those terms are mentioned in an ontology. So for this Python program, I could have thrown the entire, like the DOE report, which again informs the Biden plan. I could have thrown the entire report to the Python program. But what I did was I only picked the sections of the report relevant to this talk. Just because to save time, I didn't want the Python program to identify a whole bunch of words that related to like geologic sequestration, which is important, but we're not talking about that in this talk. So to save time, those have not been included. Same thing, if you look at the Farm Bill, I actually threw the Farm Bill through to the program too, but I didn't throw the entire Farm Bill. I threw the parts of the Farm Bills. In the case of the Farm Bill, it's called titles, right? I threw 2 titles to the Farm Bill. One title talks about conservation, so it talks about the Conservation Reserve Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, and other conservation programs. I also talked through the part of the Farm Bill, Title 8, talking about forests, about wildfires and reforestation, afforestation. So those parts were thrown to the Python program, and the Python program picked out what are those terms in the text file that corresponds to Envo terms, and the program will write to the database that, hey, you know, these are the terms that were in this text that correspond to these terms in Envo. So this is for future homework. You know, I should switch around various ontologies. I could have picked the food ontology to run against the file, because you're going to come up with a different set of terms and so on and so forth. So that's kind of homework for me. And then you can run the queries against Neo4j Bloom, which is what I tried to show earlier, but it failed because it's struggling on my machine, especially with GoToMeeting running. And if you program in Java or JavaScript or Go, there are libraries that Neo4j supports for you to query the Neo4j database from these various platforms. So we don't have much time left. We only have 4 minutes. I'm going to try to show this query again. Hopefully it doesn't bomb. Hang on. So instead of that query, I'm going to do something else a bit different. Concepts. I'm going to ask the database. This is a pre-canned query, but I'm going to ask the database to show me the concepts that are shared between the Farm Bill, right? The Farm Bill and the Agriculture Resilience Bill, which we did not go through. Agriculture Resilience Bill is proposed legislation. It's stuck in Congress right now. You know, there's no chance of it becoming law in this lame duck session. But anyway, when the next Congress sits, you know, they can pick it up again if they wish. So I'm going to run the query to the database. The database goes into the ontology terms that it knows. It's going to pick up. Oh, gosh. Okay, guys, this is a bad demo because it's struggling. I'm going to show you a different way of. I'm sorry, I couldn't show you the cool graphics. So this is another way of asking a database a question. Unfortunately, this is what you see on the screen is a Cypher script. This is the SQL-like query language. So this expression here on the screen is what I needed to type in. That's to ask the database, okay, the database, go look at the US legislation that you have on hand, associate what you have in the database, in the legislation to ontology terms that have already been previously mapped. All right, but also look at other. So for any legislation that you pick up, right, that goes to an ontology definition, look at the arrow here. It goes from legislation to ontology. You can also ask the database to go look for other pieces of legislation that goes in this direction, that goes towards the same ontology term. And so that's how I can instruct the database and to pick out these terms. Like in the Ag Improvement Act, this is the Farm Bill, right? It talks about, there's a term mentioned called dam, but the term dam is also mentioned in the Ag Resilience Act. Actually, I'm not too sure about this because I think this is an error of due to the Python program, because the dam is probably part of a word like damage, and it picks up on parts. The Python program sometimes incorrectly picks up parts of words which it thinks is this is a proper term, but it shouldn't be broken up from a term like damage. So some of these terms are not totally correct, and that needs some fixing. But things like habitat, of course, urea, it talks about in both pieces of legislation, erosion, mining, and so on and so forth. You can see here. No surprise, forestry is talked about in both pieces of law. So I'm going to stop here, but I couldn't show you the actual visualization. Actually, this database is very capable of doing very cool visualizations, but we'll do that hopefully another time. And maybe we should stop the recording here since we're out of time, but I can stay on for questions if people have questions. And sorry about the demo bomb. It was working without the GoToMeeting running.
So I should stop the recording?
Yeah, let's go ahead and stop the recording.